This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Oil may have built Saudi Arabia's empire, but in the near future, the country's big plans could come undone due to a lack of water. This has led the Desert Kingdom to look in some surprising places for new supplies. For decades, the Colorado River has been drying up, prompting the Biden administration to propose landmark water cuts for California, Nevada, and Arizona. The message from the White House is clear: make cuts now or face dire consequences later. These cuts have put a spotlight on the severity of Arizona's water crisis, and as officials scramble over how water is used and who gets access to it, Saudi Arabia is siphoning off Arizona's water for its own use. Sprawled across 3,500 acres of land in western Arizona is a Saudi-owned alfalfa farm, and the company's lease on that land allows it to pump unlimited amounts of groundwater. So how did the Saudis get such a bargain deal for the most contested resource in the West? In her book, Arid Empire, The Entangled Fates of Arizona and Arabia, Dr. Natailie Koch looks at the connections between the deserts in the U.S. and the Arabian Peninsula. Dr. Koch is a political geographer and the professor for human geography at Heidelberg University. Dr. Koch, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here.
Well, we've got that provocative title. Most Americans have no idea there's any connection between Arizona and Arabia. What is it?
Well, I actually grew up in Arizona, and I didn't quite realize that there was a connection between the places either. The initial spark for me to investigate these connections was when I heard that there was a Saudi dairy company that bought this farm in Arizona back in 2015. And this just struck me as particularly odd because I'm also a scholar of the Gulf, of the Arabian Peninsula and Gulf states. And I've discovered that there's lots of contemporary connections, but they also go really quite far back in history, largely connected to agriculture.
The Saudis have, to be generous, unpromising land. A lot of Saudi Arabia is just empty and hot and not particularly peopled. So it makes sense that if you've got a lot of money and not a lot of natural resources besides oil, you might buy things elsewhere in the world. Why does Saudi Arabia's large dairy company, Al-Marai, buy and lease land in western Arizona? Do they just do it as a business investment? Do they actually want the milk? Or is it really a sophisticated way of mining water?
It's all of the above. As it turns out, there's a kind of a more immediate contemporary set of connections that explain it, which would largely be connected to the fact that Saudi Arabia has very limited water resources. But they actually had a really large agricultural industry and were growing crops like wheat and alfalfa in the desert there in Saudi Arabia. And so the government was subsidizing this for decades. And it got so extreme that they essentially pumped all of their aquifer water, their groundwater, out of their reserves. So they started to need to look abroad, and the government banned domestic production of green crops, forage crops like alfalfa, which is what they are growing in Arizona. So they needed to look internationally for that. And a place like Arizona is good because you can grow a lot of alfalfa in a given season as long as you have water. So what the Saudis were doing in their own domestic deserts, they're now just doing in the Arizona desert. And they've got the money to drill deep, deep wells and to extract value from the land, which of course that land is giving them the rights to pump that water. The other big challenge with Arizona and why they've been in that particular spot in western Arizona is that they have located these alfalfa farms in parts of the state where there is no regulation on groundwater pumping. So they can pump as much water as they want once they've got access to that land, and that's precisely what they're doing.
That would seem to be the crux of the problem, that a scarce resource that needs to be managed if it's to survive as a resource, is largely unregulated, right?
Exactly. And this is one of the big concerns, I think, for many people, that the Saudis have already done this to their own desert, and then to see that they are coming to Arizona and approaching it in the same way. I've often been thinking about this issue around this quote from the Saudi energy minister back in 2021. He said that the Saudis were going to pump all of their oil until the last molecule. And I think that this attitude about water is the same, that they're going to pump till the last molecule, and that can be in foreign places. But of course, there's allies amongst the domestic agricultural elites within Arizona and within the US who feel very similarly, that they want to be able to pump as much as they can, and they don't want to worry about the long-term sustainability of it.
Right now, Arizona is one of several states fighting over access to the Colorado River. It would seem to be that the future of the West is really contingent on figuring out a way to regulate the use of water, the price of water, or else it can no longer grow. I mean, a place like Phoenix is in many ways kind of an impossible place, but yet there it is.
Exactly. And I think this is one of the things that makes approaching these questions about water regulation in Arizona so difficult. And what I heard when I first started asking about these Saudi farm deals several years ago, many people in Arizona, I sort of felt like thought about the water situation as a kind of Jenga puzzle. And if you moved one piece, the whole thing would fall apart and they would lose their access to the water. So it's a set of entangled laws and policies that everybody is kind of trapped in, but there isn't necessarily a broader communal sense of how to negotiate access because everybody sort of feels like they don't want to tip the balance. But of course, with the new federal mandates and cuts on the Colorado River water access in Arizona, the situation is dramatically different now. And I think many people in Arizona are starting to realize that, and they are thinking that this is the window for some changes, because without making those changes, there is no future for Arizona.
How do you get alfalfa from Arizona, which doesn't have a seaport? How do you get alfalfa to Saudi Arabia from Arizona?
Well, they are putting it on trucks and the rail. As I've also recently learned, there are many rail lines that are just completely booked because the Saudis can also get the access to the rail cargo space that other companies can't. They can outbid for that. So they're getting it on rails, sending it to ports, and then getting it on boats primarily. But the other thing that you can see with the Gulf agricultural companies like Almarai, it's way more than just a dairy company. It's actually a logistics firm as well. So they have huge investments in port facilities, in grain silos, et cetera, et cetera. And so they have this whole network around the world where they're able to control that. And then with those market control mechanisms, they're able to reduce their own costs. And in their own sustainability reports, they're kind of bragging that the train shipment makes it somehow more environmentally friendly, which I sort of find comical, but that's part of the story.
If you think about Arizona's groundwater as to think back to There Will Be Blood, a milkshake with a lot of straws in the milkshake. Almarai is one of the straws. If you either said, look, there either has to be fewer straws or they have to be smaller straws, or you just can't have are we looking at sort of tragedy of the commons writ large here? How did this Saudi company end up taking advantage of loose regulation in the United States?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned There Will Be Blood because, of course, it's based on Upton Sinclair's novel Oil, which is actually, I feel sometimes it's even more dramatic in terms of that race to the bottom sentiment. And this race to the bottom sentiment is absolutely the sort of thread running through agriculture and water politics in Arizona, that there isn't necessarily a sense of a broader good and the broader sustainability and future because those people are not thinking about the future. For them, it's a sort of short-term approach to extractivism. So for the Saudis, it's a similar story. If they come to Arizona, they can invest in those straws, the deep wells that other farmers in the area can't afford, but they don't necessarily have an attachment to the place. If they run out of water there, they can just move on. And I think it's this attitude of extraction without an attachment to place that is really quite problematic with it. And here I would just also underscore that this is not just the Saudis, that there's other dairy companies from other parts of the United States who are doing similar things. And so if all of the sort of commercial agricultural operations are approaching this in the same way, yeah, there will just be that race to the bottom.
When I was reading your book, as luck would have it, I've been to dairy farms in Arizona. I don't think they were owned by Almarai, but it is remarkable also to see silage being grown in a place with no water, a place where nothing grows naturally, and realize that all those cows, I mean, scores and scores of cows on this very large operation, are basically being fed water. In another form, obviously, but the whole thing, from the growing of the silage to fermenting it, it's taking advantage of what Arizona has in abundance, that is sun, and also taking advantage of what it really doesn't have in abundance, which is water. And you're doing something kind of crazy and impossible, making milk in the desert. If Arizona water was priced properly, would you even be able to do that competitively?
My sense is that no, you would not be able to. And this is one of the main things that I hope will change in the future. In the discussions in Arizona right now about reforming the 1980 groundwater laws, among other tools that would use, in the sort of typical American fashion, use the market to control this kind of behavior. Because at the present moment, you're not seeing a big push to keep in check some of these wasteful agricultural policies. But if the market can be used to push back against that, then there might be a future for it. I'm not entirely sure, though.
What are the interests lined up to keep things just as they are? Who wants to keep things just as they are?
The main actors would be the large agricultural companies. That would be one big set of actors. Another set of actors would be home developers, essentially. So these big developments. These companies don't want to see regulations on that because there's also then expectations that they should be able to provide water for the homes that they want to sell. And then private water companies are some of the other actors who don't want to see additional regulations on this. But agriculture is the largest user of water in Arizona, so they stand to lose the most.
And who's, if anybody, with any clout and power and influence is making the case? Are their interests lined up on the other side of the ball, saying, no, this has to change or else we're all going to end up with no water or insufficient water?
There is an increasing push among various legislators in Arizona to do this. Also, the new governor, Katie Hobbs, as well as the new attorney general, Chris Mays, they have very loudly made a point that they would like to end some of this wasteful policy framework. They are trying to do that, as I understand already. And already with Katie Hobbs coming into office after the departure of Doug Ducey, revealing that he had hidden certain documents and about Arizona's water situation and making those things public. So I think with the combination of leadership raising this as an issue and then the public within Arizona becoming more aware that there are serious problems here, I think that you are going to start to see some changes because people are quite upset. I would also just emphasize that the local media in Arizona has been doing a fantastic job of raising these water issues. They've been doing some fantastic investigative reporting, et cetera, and raising the public awareness of this. So I think that they are doing quite a good job in getting more of the general population behind this.
Going to your book, Arid Empire, you do a nice job reminding us of the long history of relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and how, in a way, this Almarai connection has antecedents that go back almost a century now, but in the other direction, with Americans going to the Persian Gulf and to Gulf nations and bringing modern concerns, modern techniques, modern agricultural science. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. The funny thing in some ways about the Almarai situation and its farm in Arizona is the fact that the Almarai is headquartered in Al Kharj, which is this farming area just outside of Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. And a team of Arizona farmers was actually brought over in the 1940s by the U.S. State Department to help set up the modern farming technologies there, which included, of course, these mechanical well pumping technologies, as well as introducing things like alfalfa production. And so this was already back in the 1940s. 1944 to 46 was when this American delegation, or rather Arizona delegation, because they were proudly advertised as having this special expertise in desert farming in Arizona, that they brought there to Al Kharj. So they helped set that up in the 40s. They also sent over a number of royal family visits to Arizona in the 1940s, in 1943 and 47. And after it was then Crown Prince Saud Al Saud, who became King Saud, he visited in 1947 and saw the dairy farms in Arizona. And when he took control of these farms back in Saudi Arabia, he said he wanted one such farm for himself and insisted that this follow the Arizona model. So this was really the beginning of commercial dairy farming in the Arabian Peninsula. This was the earliest commercial project in the entire region, inspired by Arizona. So there's this wonderful circularity where this is then the place where this major dairy company is headquartered in Saudi Arabia that has its direct roots from this Arizona connection back in the 1940s.
Do you get that moment in Saudi Arabia where the wells finally run dry without American involvement?
I think it's possible that this would have happened because the Saudis at that point that they started working with the Americans, they had advisors from Egypt and from a few other places, but they saw that they could really put a lot of their eggs in the America basket in the sense that they understood that the Americans wanted certain things from the Saudis. Already in the 1940s, if you think about the timeline of these agricultural projects in the 1940s, it seems a little crazy. But this was during World War II, and the Americans really wanted certain returns from the Saudis, and they had hoped for access to Saudi airfields during the war. This was the main thing that they were after. And so this sort of transactional relationship was something that the Americans saw a lot of possible value from, but the Saudis saw it the same. So if the Americans perhaps were not so forthcoming, then maybe they would have turned to other countries that could offer similar returns. But this moment in history was one where so many countries were competing to sort of showcase their technological advances and to use this as a tool of diplomacy. So the Americans simply got the edge in the Arabian Peninsula at around this time and really took off since then. But it's possible that they could have worked with other advisors, I suppose.
On both sides of the planet, in the Eastern and Western Hemisphere, is there an idea now that there just may be limits? There are things you can't do. It is very much discouraged in American society, an American way of thinking about the future, that you just say no and you say, well, we can't do that. Are we on the verge of an age of limits that's not pessimistic, that's not anti-progress, that's not anti-profit, but just sort of more realistic? Would you build a Las Vegas from scratch today? Would you build a Phoenix, one of the country's 10 largest cities, today from scratch? Or do you have to look at the reality of how much rain falls, how many people there are, how much water Americans use, which is a lot compared to a lot of other people on the planet? Do you just have to say no?
I really wish that we could get to that point personally. Obviously, coming from Arizona, this place is somewhere that I hope would also just understand the value of the desert for being itself and to appreciate the beauty of the desert for what it is, its intrinsic worth. So to me, this would be an important place to start in getting there, to not just develop. Unfortunately, I don't know that Arizona is necessarily going that way. I also worry about this issue quite a lot and looking at the redevelopment and in Florida, for example, after some of these major hurricanes. To me, the simple answer is to take that sort of realistic attitude and say, no, this development really can't and shouldn't happen. But of course, people are still building there. Likewise, in the Gulf countries, they are building lots of artificial islands, many of them all across the region. Artificial islands are a rage. So this kind of approach to things is not necessarily going away, but I do hope that there's a more popular awareness and resistance to this kind of development. But of course, as a geographer, I would have to say it really depends on the place and the context, because you might have a pullback in some places and a ramping up in others.
One of the commonplaces of this particular story in the American West is that, however the particulars play out, indigenous people lose. Native people just end up with the short end of the stick. Was that the case in Arizona as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that really drove me in thinking about this entire book project, that I kept hearing people in Arizona telling me that the Saudis were coming to steal our water. But the question to me is, who are we? Because, of course, as myself, a descendant of that sort of settler colonial project of taking control of the territory that we now know as the state of Arizona from indigenous people, this was not just about genocide and land theft. This was about taking water and resources and changing the relationship that indigenous people had with this particular land. And so the question, again, who are we and whose water is this? This is something that needs to be historicized, because as we see even now, right, with the Navajo Nation Supreme Court case, that this is a long-standing issue that the nations like the Navajo, the Diné, and others have challenged and fought back against from the United States theft of those resources. This is still very much the present. This is not just the past.
And I guess that is particularly challenging when you're talking about something like an aquifer, which doesn't neatly run along ownership boundaries that you can plot out with a fence or a dotted line on a map and say, okay, this water under here is ours, because there's a lot of us's when you look at an aquifer. There's tremendous borders to these things, aren't there?
Exactly. And I would really just point to the work of my Diné geography colleague, Andrew Curley, who's written quite a lot about the relationship between the Navajo Nation and the U.S. legal system when it comes to water laws. Because as he's pointed out, the fact that we have different types of laws governing surface water and groundwater, that itself is also a sort of mechanism of control, and that legal system that binds the nations into these really unjust approaches to governing the water. And so it's through that tangled web of the legal geography and how that mixes with the physical geography of the water resources that makes this really quite a difficult situation for anybody who wants to protest or challenge that.
Recently, there's been a rise in, I don't know, what would you call it, land nationalism. People are talking about preventing the sale of land or resources to foreign entities. People are talking in Texas about not allowing Chinese nationals, even if they're green card holders, that is, legal permanent residents, from buying homes or land. There's been a lot of murmuring in the American capitalist discourse about whether China should be allowed to own farmland in the United States. Does this eventually come for the Saudis? Does this have the possibility of making people look at a company like Almarai and saying, hey, wait a minute, why are we basically sending water in the form of alfalfa, sure, but it's water, to the Persian Gulf?
It already has, in fact. There's a bill in the Arizona legislature right now that is being debated and sort of worked on, which is sponsored by a number of Republican legislators that are trying to ban foreign farmland ownership, and this includes the Saudis. And it's very much following that sort of model that you've seen mostly directed at the Chinese and other parts of the United States. Of course, with this bill, as it's currently framed, it's not changing Arizona's groundwater laws. So this, again, is the root of the problem, but it makes it look like you're doing something by banning the foreign farmland ownership. Of course, there's lots of other ways that these Gulf agricultural companies have ways of getting around this, of course, using subsidiaries and all sorts of other mechanisms to still export that product internationally. So my sense is that the land nationalism component of this is not necessarily going to do anything other than allow certain people to burnish credentials that make it look like they've made a change when in fact they're simply maintaining the status quo, which is what the agricultural elites, the domestic agricultural elites in the United States want.
Natailie Koch, thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Natailie Koch is a political geographer and professor of human geography at Heidelberg University. Her recent book is Arid Empire, The Entangled Fates of Arizona and Arabia. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer, and special thanks to Maya Kegley. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.